Congress has set aside a specific fund for programs like SNAP for emergencies. And as the judge put it in federal court today, quote, "It's hard for me to understand that this is not an emergency when there's no money and a lot of people are needing their SNAP benefits." I think it's really important to be clear about what Republicans were trying to do here. They were ginning up excuses to actively force 42 million Americans to lose their SNAP benefits when they didn't have to. They were choosing to take food away from 42 million of the poorest Americans while trying to accuse Democrats of what Johnson and Republicans were actually doing. I mean, J.D. Vance actually laid out what was happening really clearly today, believe it or not.
They are trying to take a hostage, and we can't reward that behavior.
Taking a hostage. Using food that tens of millions of Americans needed as a hostage to negotiate with. That is what Republicans in Congress are trying to do here. And today, Mike Johnson laid out why. Here was Speaker Johnson earlier today responding to a question about why he wouldn't just move money around to fund SNAP. Take a listen.
Hey guys, John here. This is still developing. Speaker Mike Johnson's world is collapsing under a spiraling shutdown, food assistance cuts, and a humanitarian crisis while his own party turns against him. The blame is mounting in real time. You're exhausted, overwhelmed, and trapped between a president who demands absolute loyalty and a party that's fracturing under the pressure. And just when you think things couldn't possibly get any worse, you get a phone call from the Trump administration with news so devastating that it makes everything that came before look like a minor inconvenience. That's exactly what just happened to Mike Johnson. And the nightmare is only just beginning. The Speaker of the House is having the worst week of his political life. And it just keeps getting worse with every passing hour. The government shutdown that Johnson has been managing, or more accurately, failing to manage.
Because if you deviate from the goal of reopening the entire government, Chuck Schumer and the radicals over there will continue to play games with people's paychecks, their livelihoods. And if you do just part of this, it will reduce the pressure for them to do all of it.
There you have it. That is the game that Republican leaders are playing here. They are using Americans as leverage. They are trying to purposefully make the shutdown more painful on the poorest Americans, on federal employees too, to put pressure on Democrats to cave. Each time lying and saying their hands were tied. I mean, right as the shutdown started, the administration used it as an excuse to try to lay off thousands of federal workers, saying they had to because of the shutdown. That was their arguments. Now, courts have since indefinitely paused those layoffs because they are very likely illegal. Remember, the core of this entire shutdown is that Republican leaders are refusing to extend tax subsidies that make healthcare affordable for millions of Americans. Costs could double or they could even triple for millions of Americans. And yet, Republicans are refusing to acknowledge the very real pain that would be inflicted on Americans if those subsidies are not extended.
Is now being called the most significant domestic political crisis of Trump's entire second term. And the latest development from the administration is an absolute catastrophe that will define Johnson's speakership forever. Let me paint you the full picture of what's happening right now in Washington, because it's genuinely staggering. Trump recently returned from his Asia trip, which was itself a disaster of epic proportions. You probably saw the footage, the president looking completely lost and confused on camera, wandering around international events like he had no idea where he was or what he was supposed to be doing. It was bad enough that even his most loyal supporters were cringing, but while he was gone, the domestic situation back home went from bad to catastrophic. The government shutdown that Johnson had been trying to manage, or at least pretend to manage, had reached a critical breaking point. And instead of coming back with a plan to resolve the crisis, Trump came back with a decision that made everything exponentially worse. The news that Johnson just received from the Trump administration is the stuff of political nightmares.
They're out here decrying the so-called forthcoming health care crisis, they say.
I don't think this is going to be any kind of gut-wrenching problem if these enhanced subsidies just go away.
Unless those tax credits are extended, those subsidies, the average plan will increase for Americans by somewhere around 115%. Do you believe that Congress should extend those subsidies so that most Americans do not receive significant increases in their premiums?
Where'd you get that 115% number from?
Kaiser Family Foundation.
They retracted that. That data was run inappropriately. They changed the messaging on it. Go back and look at the website. website.
Now, that last clip was of Dr. Oz. Yes, that guy is still around. I try to forget sometimes. He's currently Trump's CMS administrator, which handles the Affordable Care Act and all of the health care coverage it provides. Now, here is the Kaiser Family Foundation website. They have not, in fact, retracted their data. The foundation still estimates that the average ACA enrollee's monthly premium would more than double, increasing by 114% if Republicans refuse to extend the subsidies. But they have a real problem on their hands because they are lying about things that directly impact the lives of millions of people. And that means millions of people in this country are starting to see the impact in their own lives and realize that what people like Mike Johnson and Dr. Oz and J.D. Vance are saying is not true.
Trump has decided not to tap contingency funding to prevent food assistance from running out. That means 42 million low-income Americans are about to lose their SNAP benefits, their food stamps, because Trump and Johnson are refusing to do the one thing that could prevent that catastrophe. Let that sink in for a second. 42 million people. That's not a small number. That's millions of families who depend on food assistance to feed their children, to put groceries on the table, to survive. We're talking about single mothers working 2 jobs who still can't afford enough food. Elderly people on fixed incomes who have to choose between buying medication and buying groceries. Disabled individuals who depend on this assistance because they can't work. Children who go to school hungry and can't focus in class.
If you use Obamacare, you can go to healthcare.gov right now and see how much your monthly premium is going to go up next year. When you see that number, you can decide for yourself if this isn't a problem like Republicans are saying. It is a problem. Today, journalists from Punchbowl News also reported that inside a meeting of House Democrats today, pollster Molly Murphy presented data on the shutdown. Data that showed that by a nearly 2-to-1 margin, voters said that preventing huge increases in health premiums for 20 million Americans was more important than ending the shutdown. The Mike Johnson plan here is not working. The Trump plan is not working. The J.D. Vance plan is not working. And that polling, by the way, was from more than a week ago. Now, leading Republicans are trying to hold food access for more than 42 million Americans hostage. I don't think the American people, no matter who they voted for or what their political party is, are going to like that. The question now is with a Republican Party that is willing to go to extremes like holding food hostage and who do not seem all too responsive to any political pressure other than from their boss and who are more than happy to just lie about everything they're doing. How do you negotiate with a party like that? How does this all end?
These are the people who are about to lose their lifeline because of a political standoff that could be resolved with a single phone call. And Johnson just publicly endorsed Trump's decision to let that aid run dry rather than compromise to end the shutdown. He's officially on the record supporting a policy that will cause mass hunger in the United States. The backlash has been immediate and absolutely brutal. Advocacy groups are condemning the decision in the strongest possible terms. Congressional Democrats are attacking Johnson relentlessly on every available platform. Even some Republicans are expressing deep concern about the political and human consequences of letting food aid lapse. But Johnson is sticking with Trump no matter what. He's backing the hardline approach, refusing to recall Congress to negotiate a solution. And the result is that Johnson himself is becoming the face of this crisis, the target of public anger, the person blamed for millions of Americans suffering. This is the nightmare scenario that every political leader fears. You become the symbol of failure. You become the person that voters associate with pain and hardship. You become the target of every late-night monologue, every campaign ad, every angry constituent call. And Johnson has walked right into it with his eyes wide open. He could have chosen a different path. He could have negotiated with Democrats. He could have tapped the contingency funds. He could have done literally anything other than what he's doing. But he chose loyalty to Trump over the welfare of millions of Americans, and now he's paying the price. The public reaction to Johnson during all of this has been particularly brutal. During a recent appearance, Johnson admitted to being so tired from dealing with the shutdown that he claimed he's working overtime, that he's exhausted from the pressure. And the response from Democrats and from the public has been merciless. Representative Jimmy Gomez from California mocked Johnson, saying, "Poor baby Mike is tired. How about the families about to lose their health insurance? How about the federal workers missing paychecks? How about the 42 million people about to lose food assistance? That kind of criticism is devastating because it perfectly captures the disconnect between Johnson's self-pity and the actual human suffering that his decisions are causing. Johnson looks weak, overwhelmed, and completely out of his depth. Reports describe him as fatigued during public appearances. He's stumbling through talking points. He's defensive when confronted with criticism. He's projecting exhaustion and defeat rather than leadership and confidence. And that perception is destroying whatever credibility he had left as Speaker of the House. Because if you're going to inflict this kind of pain on millions of Americans by maintaining a shutdown, you at least need to look like you're strong and confident in your strategy. But Johnson doesn't look strong. He looks beaten down and desperate, which makes people question why he's continuing to pursue this approach if it's clearly taking such a toll on him and causing such damage to so many people. The answer, of course, is Trump. Johnson is following Trump's lead because he's terrified of defying him and facing a revolt from MAGA Republicans. But that loyalty to Trump is coming at an enormous cost to Johnson personally and to the Republican Party politically. The party infighting is intensifying as this crisis drags on. MAGA hardliners are pressing Johnson to keep fighting, to not give an inch to Democrats, to show strength by maintaining the shutdown no matter how much pain it causes. But GOP moderates are warning that this is causing lasting damage to the party's credibility, that they're going to pay an enormous political price in 2026 if they're seen as the party that let millions of Americans lose food assistance and health care just to score political points. Those moderate Republicans are quietly, and in some cases not so quietly, expressing frustration with Johnson's leadership and with Trump's strategy. They're worried about their own re-election prospects. They're hearing from angry constituents who are being hurt by the shutdown, and they're starting to question whether Johnson is the right person to be leading the House through this crisis. The nightmare news that Trump just delivered about refusing to tap contingency funds for food aid means the crisis is about to get dramatically worse. Johnson has to defend that decision publicly, even though it's indefensible. He has to try to maintain party unity, even though Republicans are fracturing. And he has to project leadership, even though he's visibly exhausted and overwhelmed. This is a recipe for political disaster, and we're watching it unfold in real time. Let's talk specifically about what this food assistance decision actually means in practical terms. SNAP benefits, what most people know as food stamps, provide monthly assistance to low-income individuals and families to help them purchase food. It's one of the largest and most important anti-poverty programs in America, serving about 42 million people. For many of these people, SNAP benefits are literally the difference between eating and going hungry. And now, because Trump has decided not to tap contingency funds and Johnson has backed that decision, these benefits are about to disappear for millions of people. Families will suddenly have no money to buy food. That's not hyperbole. That's the literal consequence of this decision. Children will go hungry. Elderly people will struggle to afford groceries. Food banks will be overwhelmed with demand they can't possibly meet. We're going to see news reports about families with no food. We're going to hear from parents explaining they can't feed their children. And all of that is going to be directly connected to Trump and Johnson's decision not to tap the contingency funds that could prevent this crisis. The political calculation behind Trump and Johnson's position is presumably that by allowing the crisis to intensify, by letting the consequences become so severe that people are losing food assistance, they'll create more pressure on Democrats to give in to Republican demands and agree to a deal to end the shutdown. It's a strategy of deliberate escalation, making things worse in hopes that the other side will blink first. But there are several massive problems with that strategy. First, Democrats have their own political imperatives and their own constituencies who would be furious if they caved to Republican demands after Republicans deliberately let food assistance lapse. So Democrats have every incentive to hold firm and to blame Republicans for the suffering. Second, the public polling consistently shows that voters blame Trump and Republicans more than they blame Democrats for the shutdown. That means the political pressure is falling more heavily on the GOP side. Intensifying the crisis doesn't necessarily shift that blame dynamic. It might actually make it worse as more people are directly affected and angry. Third, and most importantly, from a moral and governance standpoint, deliberately allowing 42 million people to lose food assistance as a negotiating tactic is monstrous. It's using the most vulnerable members of society as pawns in a political game. Even if you agree with Republican policy goals, the means of achieving them by starving people is indefensible. The health insurance subsidy situation compounds the crisis even further. Millions of Americans get their health insurance through exchanges set up under the Affordable Care Act, and many of them receive subsidies that make that insurance affordable. During a prolonged shutdown, funding for those subsidies can also run out, which means people lose their coverage or face suddenly unaffordable premiums. We're approaching that cliff as well. So you have people potentially losing both food assistance and health insurance simultaneously because of this shutdown. That's a 1-2 punch that could devastate family finances and well-being. And again, this is a choice being made by political leaders who could end this crisis by negotiating and compromising, but are choosing not to. The situation with federal workers adds another layer of suffering and dysfunction. Hundreds of thousands of federal employees have been furloughed or are working without pay. Many of them are living paycheck to paycheck and can't afford to go weeks or months without income. They're facing evictions, they're going into debt, they're struggling to pay for necessities. Some are quitting federal service entirely to find jobs that actually pay them. And that's creating operational problems across government agencies because you're losing experienced staff and institutional knowledge. The disruptions at airports are one visible example. TSA screeners and air traffic controllers are calling in sick at higher rates or quitting because they're not being paid. That creates security risks and flight delays that affect millions of travelers. But similar problems are occurring across every area of government. Food safety inspections are being delayed, court cases are being postponed, national parks are either closed or operating with skeleton staff. The cumulative effect of all these disruptions is a government that's not functioning properly, which creates risks and inconveniences that ripple through society. And the longer the shutdown continues, the worse these problems become and the harder they are to fix even after the government reopens. Johnson's refusal to recall Congress and negotiate is particularly frustrating to people who are watching this crisis unfold. As Speaker, Johnson has the power to bring the House back into session to begin negotiations with Democrats in the Senate to try to hammer out a compromise that could end the shutdown. But he's choosing not to do that. He's keeping Congress out of Washington. He's not engaging in serious talks. He's just maintaining the status quo and hoping that somehow Democrats will surrender. That's not leadership. That's abdication of responsibility. Let's break down what this nightmare situation actually means for Johnson and for the country, because the implications are staggering: the immediate human crisis and moral failure. The decision to allow SNAP benefits to run out for 42 million Americans is one of the most callous and indefensible policy choices we've seen in modern American politics. These aren't abstract numbers. These are real people, including millions of children, who are going to go hungry because political leaders chose not to tap available contingency funds. The suffering this is going to cause is immense and preventable. Families that were already struggling are going to be pushed into genuine food insecurity. Children are going to experience hunger, which has lasting developmental and health impacts. Elderly people on fixed incomes are going to have to choose between food and medication. This is a moral catastrophe, and Johnson and Trump own it completely. They made the choice to let this happen. They could prevent it by either ending the shutdown through negotiation or by tapping the contingency funds. But they're doing neither. And that decision is going to define their legacies and haunt them politically for years. Because voters remember when politicians made choices that directly harm them. And 42 million people losing food assistance creates 42 million people with personal reasons to oppose Trump and Johnson. plus all their family members and friends who are affected indirectly. The political damage from this is going to be devastating. Johnson's visible collapse and failed leadership. Johnson admitting he's tired, claiming he's working overtime while refusing to actually negotiate or recall Congress, that's a perfect encapsulation of failed leadership. A real leader in this situation would be working around the clock to find a solution, bringing people together, negotiating compromises, taking political risks if necessary to end the crisis. But Johnson is doing none of that. He's just passively maintaining the shutdown while complaining about how hard it is on him personally. The mockery from Representative Gomez is brutal but entirely justified. Poor baby Mike is tired. How about the millions of people about to lose food and health care? That contrast highlights Johnson's complete unsuitability for the role he's in. He's overwhelmed, he's exhausted, he's making terrible decisions, and he's generating no sympathy because people can see that his exhaustion is self-inflicted and trivial compared to the suffering his decisions are causing. Johnson's visible fatigue during public appearances is also politically damaging because it projects weakness. Leaders facing crisis need to project strength, confidence, and control, even when things are difficult. Johnson is projecting the opposite. He looks beaten down and defeated, and that appearance invites more challenges and more criticism because people sense vulnerability. If Johnson looks strong and defiant while pursuing this strategy, it might at least be politically sustainable, even if morally wrong. But looking weak while pursuing a catastrophic strategy is the worst of both worlds. It generates maximum criticism with minimum respect. The Republican Party fracture that's accelerating. The shutdown crisis is intensifying divisions within the GOP that were already present but manageable. MAGA hardliners want Johnson to keep fighting no matter what. They view compromise as surrender. They're willing to let people suffer if that's what it takes to win the political battle against Democrats. But moderate Republicans are increasingly alarmed by the direction this is going. They understand the electoral consequences of being the party that let 42 million people lose food assistance. They're hearing from their own constituents who are suffering. And they're starting to question whether following Trump and Johnson off this cliff is worth it. That divide is creating real problems for Republican cohesion and effectiveness. You can't function as a unified party when you have fundamentally different views about whether causing mass suffering is an acceptable political tactic. And Johnson doesn't have the political skill or authority to bridge that divide. He's not a unifying figure who can bring different factions together. He's just a Trump loyalist who's doing what Trump wants and hoping everyone else falls in line. But they're not falling in line. The cracks are widening. And at some point, those cracks might lead to Republican members breaking with leadership to negotiate with Democrats, or to an effort to remove Johnson as Speaker, or to some other form of revolt that makes the situation even more chaotic. The 2026 electoral implications that are coming into focus. This shutdown, and particularly the decision to let food assistance lapse, is going to be a defining issue in the midterm elections. Democrats are going to run ads showing hungry children and families and asking why Republicans chose to let them suffer. They're going to make the case that the GOP is so extreme and so beholden to Trump that they're willing to cause massive harm to win political points. And those ads are going to be devastating because they'll be based on actual events that voters remember and that affected them or people they know. Republicans in competitive districts are going to have a very hard time defending their support for the shutdown and for the decision not to tap food aid contingency funds. Many of them will try to distance themselves from Johnson and Trump, claiming they disagree with the strategy but couldn't stop it. But that kind of post hoc distancing rarely works well electorally. Voters tend to hold the party in power accountable for what happens during their time in office. And what's happening during Trump's term is a catastrophic shutdown that left 42 million people without food assistance. That's going to hurt Republicans badly in swing districts and competitive races. The nightmare news that Johnson just got from Trump is nightmare news for the entire Republican Party, not just for Johnson personally, because this decision is going to cost them seats and possibly cost them their House majority depending on how severe the backlash is, the absence of an endgame or exit strategy. One of the most troubling aspects of this entire situation is that there's no clear endgame. Johnson and Trump seem to be operating on the assumption that if they just hold firm long enough, Democrats will eventually cave and agree to Republican demands. But there's no evidence that's going to happen. Democrats have their own political incentives to hold firm, and the polling shows voters blame Republicans more for the shutdown. So what's the plan if Democrats don't cave? How long are Trump and Johnson willing to let the shutdown continue? What's the breaking point where they decide the costs outweigh any potential benefits? These questions don't seem to have answers. Or if they do, Johnson and Trump aren't sharing them. And that lack of strategic clarity is itself a problem, because it means we could be looking at a shutdown that continues for months with escalating consequences and no resolution in sight. That kind of prolonged dysfunction and suffering is unacceptable in a country as wealthy and powerful as America. We have the resources to prevent people from going hungry. We have the mechanisms to fund government and provide essential services. The only thing preventing that from happening is political leaders choosing to maintain a shutdown for ideological or tactical reasons. And when those leaders don't even have a clear plan for how the situation ends, that's negligent governance bordering on disaster. The bottom line here is devastatingly simple. Mike Johnson just got nightmare news from Trump about refusing to tap food aid contingency funds. And that nightmare is about to become reality for 42 million Americans. Johnson's decision to back Trump's position shows he's prioritized loyalty over leadership, over compassion, over effective governance. The human cost is going to be immense. The political cost to Republicans is going to be severe. And Johnson himself is visibly collapsing under the pressure while generating no sympathy because his exhaustion pales compared to the suffering he's causing. This is a crisis of leadership, of moral failure, of political miscalculation. And it's all happening in real time with devastating consequences for millions of people. Johnson's speakership is unlikely to survive this intact. His reputation is destroyed. His effectiveness as a leader is gone. And the policies he's pursuing and his blind loyalty to Trump are going to haunt the Republican Party for years. The nightmare news just keeps getting worse. Johnson has no plan to address the crisis, suggesting either incompetence or indifference. The resulting political and humanitarian catastrophe is a tragedy for those who will suffer and a clear indictment of leadership failure. Next, I'll look at whether there's any path back from the brink.